Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Ideas of China, bright and early, very dedicated audience. Thank you so much for coming. All of you will get an extra cup of chai after this session. Courtesy GLF, of course. Okay. Ideas of China. As we sit right here in Jaipur, 150 kilometers from Delhi, the capital of India, which has been facing off with China these last several months very openly. But I'd like to expand the discussion this morning beyond the India-China face-off. We will have that, of course. But I think we must take my absolutely distinguished panel this morning, and we have to hopefully we'll absorb some of the ideas that we hear from them on this very, very important subject and listen to what they feel about this rise of China. Is it an inevitable rise? And what is it that makes the Middle Kingdom expand its influence across the world? So from my right, may I introduce Tom Miller, who's written 2 books on China. One of them is called China's Asian Dream, and the other one, Tom? China's Urban Billions. Tom has a Chinese wife. He's lived in China for 14 years, speaks Mandarin, and has traveled across the country and written about the country. Dr. Raja Mohan, the director of Carnegie India. Carnegie is a US think tank, and Dr. Raja Mohan is a very well-known strategic affairs analyst, one of India's formidable thinkers in the strategic realm. And Cheng, a French sinologist who works at the, who is the chair of intellectual history, of Chinese intellectual history at the Collège of France, Collège de France. Sorry, my pronunciation isn't great. At the Collège de France in Paris, and was born and grew up in Paris in France, but is of Chinese origin, and will talk to us about the ideas that moved China. And on my left is Nicolas Idier, who is now a cultural diplomat. By that I mean he works in the cultural diplomacy section of the French embassy in Delhi, has lived in China, has traveled across China, and has written this beautiful book on China today, on contemporary China, on young people. Unfortunately, it's in French, but hopefully there will be an English.
And Chinese.
And Chinese. And hopefully there will be an English translation very soon. So may I begin this discussion by asking you, Anne, about the ideas of China and what you think are the ideas that move you and move the world.
Well, thank you, Jyoti. Do you hear me? Is the mic? No?
Yes.
No? Here? Yeah, okay. Yes, I think I have to hold it closer. So, first of all, I should say how happy and moved I'm to be here at the Jaipur Festival, because I had heard of it for so many years from Indian friends. And I had never dreamt of being here, you know, on stage, you know, one day. So it's like a dream come true. The first thing I would want to say is that I don't want to think of the relationship between India and China in terms of face-off. Of course, we've been witnesses to what happened, especially last summer. It's been happening for a few months. These standoffs at Doklam, etc. Yesterday, I was sitting on a panel with Rita Chaudhary, who is an Assamese writer who's been writing this book called in English Chinatown Days, where she talks about the condition of some Chinese workers who were hired as coolies and slaves in the starting from the late 18th century to Assam to care about the tea plantations in Assam. And then the novel goes down to the 1962 Indochina War. And my message yesterday was really that the thing that we certainly don't want is another war between India and China. And I'm really, of course, I'm only a poor, modest academic, and I've written a book about the history of Chinese thought, trying to put forward what China owes to India, especially, through the Buddhism mediation. And so really I want to be...
Give us a flavor of that. What are the one or two ideas from your book that you talk about?
Yes, I think that, I'll say it very bluntly because I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I think that Chinese thought wouldn't be anywhere, without the import of Indian influence, you see, and especially, of course, through the very famous mediation of Buddhism. You see, you all know about the Chinese monks who traveled all the way from China, to India, starting from Faxian in the 5th century, and then Xuanzang, in the 7th century. So they why did they do that? Take up this very perilous trip to China. Is that they felt that the source of inspiration and thinking would be in India, and for them, the real Middle Kingdom was actually India.
Dr. Rajamohan, may I ask you to talk a little bit about the Middle Kingdom that Anne refers to and how the Chinese looked at India as the Western heaven. So these ideas that have percolated through the centuries, how Nehru was so entranced with the idea of China, a fellow Asian power, and how then it came to be seen as a betrayal of sorts.
Yeah, as the Chinese friends say that, look, in Beijing, India and China have a long history, out of which only a very small part we've been doing face-up. So I think the history, because it's just across the Himalayas, the interaction between China and India, I think, declined after the 10th century AD. Till then, both across the Himalayas through Buddhism, and Buddhism also went by sea to China. The South Indian kingdoms, especially the Chola kingdom, there was a lot of trade with China through Southeast Asia. So there was a rich, engagement between the two societies. But I think after the 11th century, then it was really the colonial experience that got us. Now, the Indian and the Chinese nationalists in the 1920s, when for the first time India and China met, Nehru was leading the Indian delegation to the anti-imperialist Congress in Brussels. So there was a Chinese nationalist delegation. And both of them said, look, we're here, we're going to overthrow colonial yoke, we're going to create a new world order, we're going to be the new guys changing the face of the earth. Now, that idea that India and China can work together to change the world, overthrow the Western dominance of the international system, that's been a running thought. But the tragedy has been, when it came to the crunch, the two great societies could not connect.
But why?
That's what I'm saying. Like you said, just 1928, you have Nehru and the Chinese talking about, we're going to work together. Second World War came, and the Chinese were fighting the Japanese, and the Indians were fighting the British. So Chiang Kai-shek, in fact, came to Calcutta, told Gandhi that, look, why don't we first do the Japs and then we'll do the Brits. Now, but the point is, Gandhi, but the Gandhi said, no, there's no way. We are in a Quit India movement. We can't help you. So when it came to the crunch, just 10 years after this great sentiment, people, in the 1950s again, we said we were great buddies. 62 happened. In the 70s and 80s, we've tried to connect again. Today, again, you're back to the problem. And I think there is the problem of territoriality. There is the problem of Tibet. There is the problem of Kashmir. That till we find a way of satisfactorily recognizing the other side's territoriality. And that's where I think we're trapped in that. And I think as today with the surge of nationalism, I think it's going to make it that much harder. But Nehru, Tagore, in fact, did so much to connect the two societies. But I think we're going through a bad phase. I would think at this point, how do you limit the conflict and go back to maybe the next phase, we'll see a better period.
So Tom, can I ask you about your book? And you know, I read this beautiful piece that you had in The Guardian where you talked about China's expanding influence today under Xi Jinping. And we know that now he's inscribed, the Xi Jinping thought has been inscribed in the Chinese sort of, what we would say, the preamble, actually. Yeah. But tell us about the East Wind, this train that you call, that is named the East Wind, which took 16 days to travel 7,500 miles across 8 countries, from China to the UK, and a few months later made its first return journey, delivering Scotch whiskey, pharmaceuticals, and baby products to the wholesale markets of Yiwu on China's east coast. What's going on?
Okay, so this is all about the so-called Belt and the Road, which I'm sure people here have heard of. But so that's the shortened version of the Silk Road economic belt, which is China's attempt to build new infrastructure across Eurasia. And the other part is the road, which actually is at sea. It's a little bit confusing, but that's short for the 21st century maritime Silk Road, which is about building better port infrastructure and opening new sea lanes and sea links through the South China Sea and Indian Ocean across to Europe and the African coast. So this train that I'm talking about is part of the Silk Road economic belt, whereby China is building new roads and railways and pipelines and power grids, all sorts of infrastructure over its borders in the northwest through Central Asia into Europe. And one of the things is this train. So you know, there have actually been trains across Russia for some time, but there is now a new route that goes through a little place called Korgos, which is what they call a dry port on the Kazakhstan Xinjiang border. There are other trains that go south into Afghanistan and Iran as well. But in 2016, I think 1,700 trains made that journey across from China to Europe and then back again.
Prevail over the West Wind?
That's right, yes. Absolutely. Would you like to talk about Mao's phrase about the East Wind? Now, this train is called the East Wind, but we'd like to ask Anne, where does this come from?
Yes, of course. I mean, the idea of the East Wind would be part of the Chinese revolutionary law, you know, especially the Maoist revolution, and of course then. Paradoxically, it was transferred onto a very capitalistic object, meaning the brand of a car. You know, you have the East Wind cars, you see, and so the paradox here as well. I mean, Tom Miller has been talking about the OBOR, you know, one belt, one road, but I would remind people that the ancient Silk Road would in particular lead to India, and now it sort of circles around it.
And goes to Pakistan. So Nicolas, can I ask you to talk a little bit about your book and the short English introduction, the introductory paragraph that we read was, and may I read this aloud to you? As skyscrapers spring up on the horizon and the metros dig immense subterranean tunnels, they dream as they look towards the stars. These are the young people of China. They live a parallel life, rhythmic, fast, brutal, sometimes overwhelmingly joyous, and then again incredibly sad. They are poets, rockers, lovers. They never sleep, drink too much, run breathlessly down deserted sidewalks.
Yes, thank you. In fact, you know, speaking about ideas of China, I always have this feeling that we are considering China as a monolith, as a wall. And after having been living in China for some years, I really wanted to depict a situation of individualities, to remind the readers and to remind my friends and my, even why not my colleagues, how much China is not a monolith. And if you consider the new generation of today, they are not interested that much by politics anymore. In fact, I've been always quite surprised by the fact living in gigantic cities, living in places where it's difficult to find a place, not having the choice of your government, not having the choice of any political decisions, it has creating a kind of a new sort of freedom. I don't know if it's a real freedom, because it's not a freedom based on the choice of a democratic choice, but it's a freedom of individual choices. And I wanted to investigate in this.
But China is not a democracy, so what is this whole question of freedom anyway? Because it's becoming a richer country, but the fact remains that the Chinese Communist Party wields power.
And that's why it's quite interesting to see that in contemporary culture of China there is a lot of strategies, because when you're facing that kind of dictatorship or authoritarian regime, you have to find a way out. You have to find a way aside. And I was quite interested by this new generation, like, you know, in their 20s or 30s, of poets, of musicians, of artists, because their parents have faced the 80s, and 80s, you know, after Mao's dead in 76, and from 78, 79, the first Beijing Spring, until the Tiananmen Square massacre in June 89. During this decade, 10 years of a kind of hope. You know, people were really developing a lot of creativity, a lot of freedom. There were things happening during this decade. It was not all dreamy and all perfect, of course, but a kind of hope. So then at the end, in 88, 89, people started wanting really for a democratic reform. And that was perhaps too much for the regime. And it has created a kind of end of a decade, which is really brutal. And now, for the kids of this generation, they have to deal with that. They have to deal with the failure, the political failure of their parents.
And what do you think? Do the children of China today have to deal with the political failure of the parents? And was the Tiananmen Square uprising, first would you call it an uprising, which took place in June 89, and we remember the image of that one single man stopping this row of tanks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we also remember the statue, you know, of democracy that the students actually created on the square. Yes, well, I was particularly interested in reading Nicolas Idier's novel because I was in China precisely at that time, you know, sort of late 70s, you see, because China was opening up again after the 10 years of Cultural Revolution, you know. The conventional dates would lead us from 1966 to 1976, Mao's death. I was there as a student, and I could feel that there was this you know, very strong aspiration for, you know, a breath of air, you know, of sort of new thinking, democratic construction, you see. And I must say that as a historian, I have to remind you that it's not a, you know, sort of sudden outspring of, you know, energy, you know, because I can say that in the very late 19th century, in 1898, I have to recall that there was this first attempt at political reform. The regime was still imperial, you know, the Manchu dynasty was still in place, and a few literati, Chinese literati, tried to bring in, you know, the very first attempt at reforming the political system by bringing in the sort of constitutional monarchy on the model of the, you know, British, actually, the British monarchy. But that failed, and I think that that failure in 1898, while Japan, you see, was successfully negotiating, you know, the modernization movement starting in 1868, you know, with the Meiji period. So you have Japan, you know, successfully building itself as a nation state, modern nation state, while China failed, you know, 30 years later. And I think that this failure has marked the whole history of the 20th century. You know, if you take the history of China in the 20th century, it's a succession, you know, uninterrupted succession of revolutions and wars. You see, so there was no time to you know, build up, you know, this political construction, and especially the democratic construction. So, but yeah. And just one last word. Tiananmen, 1989. We have also to remind ourselves that the students of Peking were already on Tiananmen Square in 1919, you see, on the 4th of May, you know, sort of protesting against the Treaty of Versailles, you know, the Western powers treaty. And so decades later, you have, you know, again, the students leading this protest movement on Tiananmen Square with the consequences that we know.
But Dr. Rajamohan, the idea of democracy that we talk about and beautifully describes it as a political failure over the last 100 years. So, but does it really matter whether China is democratic or communist? Why should it matter to us? What's this idea? Is it a false binary, the idea of democracy and of communism?
At least if you go by Xi Jinping, he says it doesn't matter. In fact, today, given the problems in the West and the China's extraordinary growth, the Chinese Communist Party leadership today is pretty cocky. I mean, they say, look at the democracies, is that what you want? Look at Mr. Trump, look at what's happening in Brexit. We are doing very well. Finally, China's dream is going to be met. So all this stuff about democracy is no a great deal. No, but my sense is that's a self-serving argument quite clearly for the leadership to say it. But I would agree with Anne. I mean, I think there have been a series of, you know, you want to call them uprisings, revolutions, whatever it is, from 1919, non-stop. There been 1979, there was the Beijing Spring, the movement, then there was 89. But the last 30 years, because of the general growth of prosperity, they're certainly under less of a massive public uprising. And the Chinese state today uses the modern technology to surveil the population in an extraordinary manner. I mean, no other state, even Stalin would have loved this, to have this kind of power using the artificial intelligence, using social media to be able to control the population. But I would still think that democracy, you know, is a desire that the Chinese people expressed in 1919. It's not going to be a gift from the West. It is not outsiders going to impose it. It has to come from within. And my belief, purely as a history of China, that someday the Chinese people would want it. And I think we should step back from this thing of saying, the Western argument, China should be like us, we're going to do something about it tomorrow. It's not going to work.
So to both you, Tom, and to you, Nicolas, do the Chinese people want this?
Want some democracy?
Yes.
No, I think. I don't see a great desire among ordinary people for a change in the governance system. Okay. I think something, if you look at Chinese history, something that people always fear in China is chaos. And whenever you have a revolution or a dynasty collapses, you have chaos and people die. And I think what the Communist Party does do is hold China together. And there's certainly a fear that if it collapsed, then China itself would also collapse, and it would split into several countries, essentially. So, for example, if you come from Guangdong in the southeast, do you want to subsidize people in the poor West? And so, you know, I don't see that real desire there. The fact is that ordinary Chinese people's lives have improved immeasurably over the last 30 years. There's a lot of freedom in China. There's freedom from want, for one. You know, would you rather be born poor and Indian or be born poor and Chinese? I think you'd be born poor and Chinese every time, because China has a functioning state that can actually give you an education, for example. So, you know, I think that is more important in a poor country. Things are now beginning to change a little bit, and actually we're seeing a shift in emphasis at the top. So, you know, for the last 30 years, China has pursued growth at all costs, you know, and growth delivers all. But actually the 19th Party Congress, which is the most recent big meeting of the Communist Party, it happens once every 5 years, Xi Jinping started talking about creating a better life, and about promoting quality of growth, and about giving people public goods. So I think now that China is becoming a more, if you like, middle-class country, you know, its GDP per head in nominal terms is now 8,000 US plus. In sort of real terms on the ground, it's more like 15,000. So, you know, there are a lot of people in China who are quite wealthy now. They don't just want growth. They want to live sort of happier, more fulfilled lives. That doesn't necessarily mean that they want democracy.
Nicolas, what do you think? Do they want democracy?
It's a very complicated question. First, I feel a bit embarrassed to discuss China without a Chinese writer or a Chinese intellectual living in China, because I think it's something which is always
okay,
quite...
France is an imperialist power, so you're used to that.
No, yes, basically that's perhaps why I'm saying that. So it's a complicated question. At first, I think, once more, China is not a monolith. So we should stop speaking about the Chinese people as a whole. There is many different cases. There is people in jail because of their ideas in China. There is intellectuals. The Nobel Prize, the Peace Nobel Prize, Liu Xiaobo, is dead last year because he wanted democracy. And there is a lot of people wanting democracy. I think Raja Mohan is very right. It's not only a question of technology. It's a question of, exactly like Tom was saying, you know, this kind of better life, better city, better life, global happiness, etc. It's a way to try as much as it's possible to avoid this question of a political choice. But at the end of the day, who wants democracy? When you're in a country, it's true that when you have a house, when you have a car, when you have a job, you're okay. But then there is always this very active minority of people. They can be scholars, they can be writers, they can be artists, they can be civil society like lawyers struggling against the regime today and really enduring bad times for them. And this minority is perhaps stronger than anything. And this minority is of course willing to have the choice of who is going to tell them what to do or not what to do. So they want democracy, they want to act on the government.
So Raj, can I come back to you? Would you rather be a poor Indian, as Tom says, or a poor Chinese?
Look, anyway, I don't think we have the choice. If I would rather be somewhere else. But I think the Chinese make it quite clear to the population. Look, you want to be a democracy? Look at India. And now they can even point to the United States, so they're even in a better position. But I think it's not, you know, for India, look, our system does not give you any choices today. I mean, that we have to make it work. Similarly, in the Chinese case, I would think, people are struggling to find ways to work within the system to see if they can improve it. But my sense is, eventually, change would come not from popular revolt, but by breakdown of elite consensus. Now, the question is, how long would the Chinese elite consensus sustain that? Can the party and the leadership satisfy everyone, or is there going to be a moment when that breaks down? I would think that moment will come. I mean, so far they managed it very well, but I don't know if they can manage the next crisis as well as they do today. At that point, you could say, look, I'd rather be an Indian than
So Chinese. I'm going to come back to that question, but Anne, will it take 100 years, do you think, for this elite consensus to break down? Because he seems very much in control.
Yes, well, one thing is pretty sure, is that I'm not going to live long enough to see it, you see. Well, that's too bad for me. I think, you know, if I were given the choice between being Indian or Chinese here at the Jaipur Festival, I would choose Indian, you know. Because you know, Nicolas was sort of alluding to it. We haven't got anyone from mainland China here at the festival, which is quite symptomatic of the way that India and China don't speak to each other. You know, I mean, they just turn their backs on each other, which I really deplore. You see, so I'm trying my best. You see, I mean, I look Chinese, I speak Chinese. You see, you know, but I'm you know, I'm French, so I think, you know, that Tom Miller was saying that you know, this prosperity and this social stability, this growth was bought at all costs, you see, and you have to consider the costs, you see, and when it's always a question of balance, you see, between what the gains would bring you and the costs, you see, and I think that someday the costs will be higher, than the gains. Because of course I would say, Tom was saying it, that the Communist Party, the single party, is holding China together, so that's why China looks so big, at the moment. But I wouldn't mind, China splitting up, you see, because I think that if China became a sort of federation, why not? I think the world would be much better off, you see. So I don't mind, China splitting up, you see, and I don't mind the Communist Party, collapsing. Thank you.
May I say here that, may I say here, Anne, that whatever the differences that India and China have today, but about 100 years ago, when under British Raj, when the Cambridge School said precisely that about India, which is that they don't mind India splitting up because India was never a nation in the first place to begin with. So I think that's what empires or foreign empires, and that was said in jest to Nicolas about France being a former imperial empire. But I think there is some truth in the fact, Tom, that former empires like yourself perhaps are able to negotiate what younger nations like us with, independent, India's been independent 70 years. We are perhaps not able to negotiate the hypocrisy as well as British does with China. For example, David Cameron has now been employed for $1 million by a Chinese company when just a few months ago when he was Prime Minister was raging against the Chinese. So how do you do that? How does a formal imperial empire,
right.
Power
Okay, so as the official representative of empire here,
yes.
I'll try to answer that. I think, to be fair to David Cameron, he's not a mate or anything. Actually, during his period in power, relations with China and the UK were pretty good. In fact, they called it a golden era. Because George Osborne, the finance minister, wanted to work very, very closely with the Chinese, and we let them. For example, they're going to build a big new nuclear power station in the UK, David Cameron is somebody who would have been earning a lot more had he not been PM. So I'm not surprised that now he wants to earn more cash out there. So I don't really know what else to say about that. I might just come back though to something that Anne was saying. About the country splitting up. I think your average Chinese would be horrified by the idea. Now, why is that? Mainly because they've been fed a diet of kind of nationalist propaganda from day one. That's what the Communist Party feeds them. But as Nicolas was saying, of course, China is not monolithic. People have their own ideas, even if they can't express them always in a public sphere. And so my wife, for example, she's from Beijing. She's Beijing born and bred. And in fact, during the Tiananmen uprising, I think she was 7 years old at the time, and she lived in a courtyard, a traditional one, right next to Tiananmen Square. And so she remembers the students coming in, and the people there would feed them noodles, to keep them fed. But she, for example, she now lives in the UK with me, and if you asked her, she would say, "Oh, split it up, give Taiwan back. Who cares?" So there are people like that. Not everyone is the same, of course.
So can I ask any of my panel who, if you've been to Tibet or to Xinjiang, to the frontiers of China, and I'd like to ask you how these outposts, or how do these provinces or states on the frontiers, how do they look at Beijing? Would you like to take that?
Well, it's a bit difficult, so I'll start. I spent some time actually in Xinjiang, which is it's a province, but it's not called a province. It's meant to be a kind of autonomous region, which is a bit of a joke, because of course, actually, Xinjiang is the most sort of controlled part of China. So this is the northwest sort of province in China, which the kind of indigenous population there is Muslim. And there are people there who've been fighting for independence for a very long time. And the Chinese state suppresses sort of religion there. You know, people, they go around sort of cutting off people's beards. You can't go to madrasas if you're a boy. There are all sorts of controls in place. And actually, for a few years after there were some riots back there, I think the most recent ones would have been about 5 years ago, they actually cut off all social media, they cut off the internet for basically a couple of years.
So how do they look at Beijing from Xinjiang?
So it depends who they are, right? So the majority now is actually Han Chinese, so that's what you think of as Chinese. And so when they look at Beijing, well, you know, that's, you know, they've sort of immigrated into the region, and they're probably quite happy with it because they're there to make money. If you're a Uyghur and you can't speak your own language at school, for example, they do have Uyghur schools, but if you go there, you're not going to do very well in life. And you're chafing under this oppressive regime, then obviously, you know, you probably look at Beijing with often hatred. But, you know, people have different opinions, and I have met Uyghurs who actually do very nicely out of the system if they're willing to play the political game. But, you know, not everyone is the same.
So, Raj, tell us about the Tibet relationship, the special relationship that India and China have.
Look, I think just a word on the empires. I mean, I think we should be careful using it as a term of abuse, because a lot of people are throwing it at India and China as well. That the second question you asked about the nature of the peripheries to the heartland, that I think is a messy one. Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, even southern China. I mean, I think they don't, you know, share the so-called core national narrative. So the one way of this could change, of course, is the, you know, if a democratic China can be a federal China. That China, there's no option only between an authoritarian centralized system versus broken up China, that there's something in between, which is a federational, a China that is far more tolerant of its minorities, will give space and distance its due. The Democratic Charter 88 actually they do talk about federalization of China, giving the rights of minorities, not in word, but in actual practice. But I think Tibet is a very special case for India and China in a sense that is part of the heart of the problem, because Tibet has been historically a bridge between India and China. We started out with Buddhism, and that India had special relationship. The Chinese resent that special relationship today. They would want to cut it off. So that's where the problem is. And I think when we talk about India-China border, it's actually Indo-Tibetan border. So therefore, if we don't come to an understanding of how to make Tibet a bridge again between India and China, that is, can we let people more freedom for the Tibetans to come and visit the Dalai Lama or to visit the temples in India? Can Indian Buddhists go more easily to Lhasa and other places? This is where the challenge is, that can we do that without threatening each other's territoriality? That's where the challenge is. And I think that is the core for India and China, that China does not recognize Kashmir, China doesn't recognize Arunachal Pradesh, India thinks there is still a different relationship between Delhi and Tibet. Unless we transcend these, and I think that's the only way of doing it is greater democratization, greater decentralization, and where our frontier regions, where they meet each other, can actually become more open towards each other.
Right. Mm-hmm. Anne?
Yes, as Raj Mohan was saying earlier, I think when I say we, it's mainly India and China, since it's the topic of our panel. We have inherited an impossible situation, both from the fact that India, China, and the British were all empires, but then sort of challenging each other in a growing context of nation states, and so we are stuck with this problem of territoriality, because you have to know that the Xinjiang and Tibet were conquered by the Manchus, you see, And so that's why, you know, the Chinese now claim that these territories are Chinese, but actually you can say that they're Manchu, and since the Manchus are no longer there, you know, so there is this controversy, you know. But now we're just stuck with these territoriality problems because of this modernizing context, you see, of empires turning into nation states, you see. So I think we should try to think beyond that, you see. That's,
So, Nicolas, what do young Chinese people, what do they think about India? Do they even think about India?
I think, as Cheng was saying, India and Chinese are not really meeting together nowadays. But if you're looking at some Chinese intellectuals, India for them is clearly Buddhism origins. So they think there is quite a lot of books about India, and you know this connection also of one of the Silk Roads, like from the Dunhuang to India. So it's quite India, according to a lot of young people in China, is a very religious, spiritual place. And I think, in a way, it's quite interesting because we are always thinking that, okay, China is all about politics and India is all about religion. This is a question of perception. But in a way, Chinese politics are up to a level which is nearly getting a religious status. And in the same way, in India, religions are getting at a kind of level which is reaching politics, and then it's becoming politics.
So we don't seem to really know each other, do we?
No, I just wanted to add something to that, if possible. So I remember when I first arrived in China, sort of about 20 years ago, I've always traveled to India because I've always been a big sort of Indophile. And when I would tell people I'm off to India to go on holiday in China, they would go, "What, are you mad?" So, you know, but people saw India as backward and dirty, to be frank, and sort of where China had been and China was escaping from. But I've seen that changing in the last sort of 5 or 10 years. You see many more Chinese tourists now who want to come to India. And I think there is a sense now in which people see India's economy growing faster. Perhaps it hasn't been growing quite as fast in the last couple of years. But they see that India is advancing. And I think that message is really getting across, actually, in China. So I think that's quite positive for India.
So, Raj, can I bring you back to Mao's thought about the east wind prevailing over the west wind, and if it doesn't, that the west wind prevails over the east wind? So is this the core of Xi Jinping's rise, the rise of China? He believes that China will rise. It's an inevitable rise. And as China expands its influence in the Indian neighborhood.
No, I think that is the claim today. I mean, I think last year when he went to Davos, Xi Jinping said, now China is going to lead globalization. They think the moment has come, that they're going to now run the world, and that they're going to design new rules. When you tell them, look, South China Sea, you're violating the law of the sea, they say, look, we didn't write these rules, we're going to write new rules. So I think there is an extraordinary self-confidence and self-assertion today that the moment in the sun has come, now is the time that China must no longer hide and bide, but now it must step out, take more responsibilities for managing the world. I mean, that is the core premise at this point of time. Now, it's an entirely different matter whether that will succeed or not. But I think for the challenge for India, I mean, I would say is that, look, that we've seen this before. I mean, I think, I'll just give you an example. When Tagore went to China after he won the Nobel Prize, he went to speak at Beijing University, Beida. That time, I mean, Tagore was a spiritual figure, of course, and he was talking about spiritual civilization. So the Chinese Communist Party cadres disrupted his meeting, saying, look, we don't want this spiritual crap. I mean, we want modernization. We want material civilization. We want westernization. That's what China needs to escape its feudal thing. And the Tagore was actually representing a feudal India. The same metaphor, that sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But I think now, 50 years later, they adopt the term spiritual civilization. So I think there are cycles of up and down where India sometimes figures as a dirty place, might be the Western heaven, but it's really fallen behind us. There are times when there are people who see, look, India has somehow managed to get across democracy. There are people who admire that. So I think it's a very complicated relationship. And I think for us in India, I would think the challenge is to go beyond the bilateral issues, beyond the current territorial disputes that we have? Can we understand China qua China? Can we understand what drives it, what animates it? There, I think, Jyoti, you are right. We've really not invested enough in this country in knowing China. There's a lot of political sloganeering. There's a lot of hostility, but there is no attempt at understanding China on its own terms. I mean, not because China is good or bad, because China, I think, second largest economy, soon to be #1 economy. It is going to be an extraordinary power to reckon with in the world. If nothing else, in our own self-interest, I think we got to invest more in understanding China.
Okay, so let me open this discussion to the House and then we'll take this forward. Yes, please, go ahead.
Good morning. I'd be especially interested, Tom and Nicola, in your thoughts on China's relations with Russia and perhaps Japan. It's an interesting discussion, China, India, and one talks a lot about the US, but the big neighbor to the north and Japan.
So from Tom or from Nicola?
Both.
Both, okay.
So I'll start, or do you want to start, Nicola? Please, please. Oh. Well, that's a difficult question, and of course, if you go back to the times of the Soviet Union, obviously relations with China after a very good start were very, very difficult indeed, and yeah, they're vastly improved now compared to how they were then. I think the best way of looking at it is to think of them as frenemies, if you like. So, I mean, Xi Jinping and Putin are very happy to get together and be the strong men together. So, for example, when you had the big parade in Beijing a couple of years ago, it was the 70th anniversary of victory over Japan, as they called it, and you had missiles being wheeled through Tiananmen Square or just past Tiananmen Square, and phalanxes of soldiers marching. Putin was there standing by Xi Jinping's side. Likewise, when there was something similar in Moscow that year, Xi Jinping was there too. Now, there's a good reason for that, because they are neighbors and they have to work together. Also, at the time, Russia was suffering because of what had gone on in the Ukraine and Western sanctions, and they were doing a very, very big gas deal with the Chinese worth, we don't know how much, but probably $200 billion. Right, so Russia needs to sell its gas to China too. So there are very, very good reasons why they have to work together. At the same time, if you go to the Russian Far East, they're terrified there of being sort of taken over by the Chinese. And you were talking before about the Manchu conquest of Xinjiang, but actually a huge part of the ancestral Manchu lands were taken by Russia, sort of millions of square kilometers. And there is a fear in Russia that actually China at some point will want that land back. And in the Chinese northeast, you have a population of it's about 120 million people, but over the border in Russia, it's about 8 million, I think, or even less. You have a lot of Chinese workers going over there, so there are fears about that. I think the other thing to look at is Central Asia, because that's where the two meet. And of course, Central Asia, this was Soviet territory. When the Soviet Empire dissolved, there was really a kind of void there, and China has moved in. So economically, Central Asia now is dominated by the Chinese. Just to give you one example, a quarter of Kazakh oil is Chinese controlled, yeah. And all of the pipelines and roads used to go north-south, and now they're going east-west. And there is friction there between China, the great economic power, and Russia, which is still the political power in the region and the sort of military strategic power. But as China's economic assets grow, then obviously that has a sort of political impact too. And I think we may see some more tension between Russia and China in future.
Right, Nicolas?
Yes, it's also a question of aesthetics. Of course, when you're in Beijing or when you're in some cities, there is a lot of buildings. There is, of course, a lot of contacts. For example, Chinese modernism painting in art history is really influenced by Russian modernism. And I must say that when it was in 2001, first time I was in China at the university, it was in Dalian. Dalian is northern of China, in the...
Port Arthur.
Yes, Port Arthur. And it was at some point a Russian city, so all the architecture is really, really Russian. It's quite interesting. And in Beijing, you have a lot of, quite large Russian community. You have also, of course, some trades people.
Did you say Russian?
Russian, yes.
Okay.
Russian community. You have, of course, a lot of trade. And when I was studying economics at Chinese university, I was living with a Russian boy coming from Vladivostok. It was quite interesting for me. And you have also, speaking about migration and people-to-people contact, must say that there is also a very low kind of migration from Russia to China. And a lot of prostitution in northern China is coming from Russia. A lot of traffic also is coming from Russia. And it's quite interesting that a Russian, for example, in Beijing, are not like the common strangers. They have a kind of different status, which is quite interesting, I think, when you look at it.
Okay, please ask your question. No.
Thank you so much, Professor Cheng. This is Ananta here. Now, I have one quick query to Professor Cheng and another to Professor Mohan. Is that in terms of the contemporary Chinese world in China, and China as part of the world, along with the geopolitical considerations that have been discussed, now what are the intellectual dimensions? For example, what are contemporary intellectual movements in China? Okay. One would imagine Neo-Confucianism on source, and the kind of
So we'll have to just, because we're running out of time.
Yes, I need 1 second to utter my sentence so that it is legible, madam.
Thank you, sir.
We are all operating with constraints. So it is in that spirit that the contemporary intellectual and discursive climate in China, are there different voices, for example, which is trying to raise a different way of being with the world, for example, the idea of Tianxia, all under heaven, which might be interpreted in a director of global responsibility rather than hegemony.
Thank you.
My query to Professor Rajmohan is...
Sir, just one question, please. No, I'm so sorry, but just one question, but there's lots of hands up. Thank you so much. Anne.
Yes, well, I can't answer this question in in under 1 minute. You see, even more wouldn't be enough. I just wanted to say that Nicolas has been mentioning these artists and intellectuals, you see, who would, sort of have this crave for more democracy, more freedom for expression. But, we shouldn't forget also all these Chinese who have these religious aspirations. You see, I mean, you have an increase in, in the, let's say, church, temple going in China, which have revived ever since the Cultural Revolution. So people weren't, constrained to do that. I mean, that's about the only thing they're not constrained to do. And so that means that, there are some religious aspirations, something beyond, material needs. It's okay, to have sort of a comfortable life, etc. But it's not enough, certainly. So I think we have to take into account all these people that, and so that, sort of makes for an unpredictable future.
Shall we just take a few questions together?
Yes, it is said that if India goes, China goes, and if China goes, India goes. A comment from the panelists. And incidentally, I organized an international conference on Bodhidharma, who went to China, and
yes,
connection between.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the lady at the back.
Hi, ma'am. My question's for Dr. Raja Mohan.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on India's Tibet card, and do you think it was a missed opportunity in Indian diplomacy?
Okay, you got India's Tibet card. Yes, sir. Yes, and after that. And here.
Hello. Looking at the entire gamut of the way the relations between India and China have developed from the Nehruvian time, when Nehru was actually encouraging China to become a member of the world bodies, to today, what is it that China wants from India? Is it just a question of territoriality? Because I think it is too small a problem for them to wage a war with a large neighboring power.
Right. Would you like to?
Hello everyone, I'm from Austria. Edwin, I love both countries, China and India. I've been living here for the last 12 years. Why do I love it? Chinese called India once Zhongguo, the central country, and China called itself the central country.
So you'll have to ask a question, I'm
Isn't
afraid.
it beautiful, this relationship?
Right.
And Confucianism means evolve your character.
Right.
So the stress is on family, the cosmos means family. So we can be very trustful to the Chinese.
So what's your question?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think let's just have closing comments. And no, this young guy at the back, I think I've been denying him a question. Go ahead, ask your question, and then the young lady in the middle, and we'll wind up. Yeah.
So my question is, I want you to comment about the equation that China has with North Korea in light of it aggravating the air of distrust between China and
Thank
global.
you. Yes, ask your question, please.
Hi, this is for the Mohan sir. Can you just throw some light on the developing relationship between China and Pakistan?
Okay. So shall we just take closing comments, and then you can answer. Dr. Rajamohan, why don't you have one actually, but.
Yeah, I think on the Tibet card, I mean, I think it's a mythical card, I think, that, look, you play Tibet card, which is what we did in the 60s. The Chinese played the card in the Northeast. So it's not that, the idea that you are free to exercise a card without expecting something from the other side. Those of you old enough will remember 1960s, China was supporting every single insurgency in the Northeast. So you have actually, that's again, I think, takes us back to the question, look, we are both multinational countries. We can hurt each other by supporting secessionist movements in both the countries. In fact, you remember 60s, the Chinese said, the Naxalite movement is going to, one spark will light a prairie fire, and that India is going to rise in great revolt. So I think we played each other's cards. But the problem today is not that you have a Tibet card. The problem at this point for India is, look, Chinese economy today is 5 times bigger than India's. Chinese defense budget is 4 times bigger than India's. So I think there is a time, just as when the Chinese said, look, keep your head down and do your development. India at this point, you have to manage your relationship with China, develop faster, so that you create the capabilities to deal with a much more powerful northern neighbor. On Pakistan as well, I think that brings back to the same question. China-Pakistan relationship are more than 60 years old. It's deeper than the Indian Ocean, higher than the Himalayas, sweeter than honey. Now, that's what the Chinese say. Now, I think for us, again, if we don't reconcile with our neighbors, Chinese don't have to do anything to undermine you in your own neighborhood. So that again takes us, we need to fix our neighborhood. We need to resolve our problems. And I think that is the challenge. So territoriality is just one issue, but I think it is linked. I think that's where the distrust is built on that. So that's where the problem is. If we remove that, a whole lot of other things can be done much more easily.
I might just add one thing on Pakistan, actually. So though I think there's actually lots to say, but I was speaking to a guy who's quite well connected in Beijing and works a lot in Pakistan as well. And he said the real reason for the China-Pakistan economic corridor is that it's a giant bribe from the Chinese government to Pakistan to say, look, sort out the security mess because we're worried about it.
And you have the last word.
Yes. Well, I'm here to sort of refresh our memories. You see, this Chinese arrogance, you see, this Chinese cockiness is very recent, actually. We should remind ourselves that only 10 years ago we were still talking about Chindia, all right? So we have to remember that both China and India are, very ancient civilizations. We should also reason in terms of civilizations, you see. Where were the British, you see, 3,000 years ago, and not to talk about the Americans. So, let's remember that. Thank you.
Okay, Nicolas, you have the last word.
And something I think which is quite important for China, we should consider that there is a plurality in China. And if we can have this plurality of China in a very pluralist country like India, it would be absolutely great.
A big hand to my panel, Nicolas Idier and Cheng, Dr. Rajamohan, Tom Miller. Thank you so much.